Hey, welcome to the Psychotherapy Brown Bag YouTube channel. It's been a little while since I've done one of these videos. It's going to be a little bit sporadic just when I have a moment to do something like this. Sometimes I'll think to do it, sometimes I won't. So today I just really quickly wanted to talk to you guys about one of the sort of prevailing myths about suicidal behavior. I'm in the middle, or actually just wrapped up doing my lecture on suicidal behavior in my abnormal psychology class, so it's been in my mind, and it seems like a useful bit of information to have out there. And so a myth I want to talk about today is the idea that assessing for suicide risk or talking about suicide with people puts the idea in their head and therefore is dangerous. So, this is a really important question. If talking about this subject is going to make people be more suicidal, well, then that should influence whether or not we talk about it and who we talk about it with and how we talk about it. So fortunately, though, this is really an empirical question. We can look at this and study it and see whether it turns out the way people sort of fear it might. And Madelyn Gould did sort of the probably most prominent study on this topic, the one that's cited the most often. It's not the only one, but it's a really, really well-cited one, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2005. What she did was she recruited a total of 2,342 students at 6 high schools in the northeastern U.S. and divided them, or randomly assigned them, to either the experiment group or the control group. And all the students, no matter what group they're in, were assessed twice. Once one day and then another time 2 days after that. In the experiment group, what happened is that the students were assessed for suicidal ideation and past history of suicide attempts. So people ask, are you having any thoughts of suicide? Can you tell me about any past attempts you've had at suicide? And then after that, they also assessed, well, how distressed are you? Just sort of general symptoms of distress, whether that's depression or any other sort of negative affect variable. 2 days later, they did the exact same thing. In the control group, on day 1, the only thing they did was ask about distress. But at day 2, they did everything they do in the experiment groups. They ask about suicidal ideation and previous attempts, as well as distress. And so the idea here is that if asking about suicide, if assessing for risk and bringing the topic up in general is iatrogenic, it causes harm, well then folks in that experiment group should become more distressed, they should think about suicide more, we should see some difference in their response relative to the people in the control group. Fortunately, I would say, that turned out not to be the case, and so I'm going to scroll down here and make sure I say the results accurately. And so first of all, the experiment group and the control group did not differ in how upset they were immediately after that day 1 assessment. So the people who were assessed for suicide risk were no more upset than the folks who weren't, meaning that assessing for suicide risk was not a distressing phenomenon on average for people in the experiment group. Additionally, feelings of depression in the 2 days following that didn't go up. There were no differences between the groups and how depressed they were. So that means that when the experimenters asked the people in the experiment group about suicide, it did not make them more upset in the immediacy right after that, and it also didn't make them feel more upset, specifically more depressed, in the following 2 days after that. So that's your first set of information that's really useful. Another step further they took with the results is that the experiment group actually showed no more suicidality in terms of suicidal ideation, thoughts of suicide, than did the people in the control group in the 2 days following. So asking about suicide not only wasn't distressing, didn't cause increased depression, it didn't even cause people to think about suicide any more than the people who weren't asked about it. So that's really compelling information, but you can raise a really sort of important point. You can say, well, these are kids in high school, maybe it's not a problem to ask about suicide if people aren't at risk, but maybe people who are vulnerable, people who have a history of suicide, people who are feeling depressed, maybe it's a big deal for them. That's another really excellent question, but fortunately, Madelyn Gould and her colleagues thought to answer that question as well, and so they assessed, remember, for past history of suicide and depressive symptoms. So they had the data to look at this question. And so what they found, fortunately, was that actually people who were exposed to suicide questions and who were depressed or had higher levels of depression as measured by the Beck Depression Inventory, specifically with scores of 15 or higher, they did not demonstrate increased distress or suicidal ideation following the suicide assessment. And in fact, depression scores in those folks were lower than folks in the control group after the first assessment. So depressed folks who got assessed for suicidality, their depression scores went down. So it's not just that it didn't hurt those vulnerable people, it made them feel better. Taking that even one last step further, they looked at folks who have a past history of suicide and said, well, if we asked them about suicide, did that make them think about the topic more? And it turns out, no, it didn't. They were no more likely to think about suicide. In fact, there was less suicidal ideation in the folks with a past history of suicide attempts when they were asked about suicide than in folks with that same history who weren't. So asking about it made those people think about it less, which I know might sound a little bit counterintuitive, but maybe if you think about it another way, it doesn't. You know, the question that made people investigate this in the first place was, if I ask you about this, is this going to put it in your head and make you think in a way and act in a way that you wouldn't otherwise, that would be dangerous? But look at it from the other side. What if someone is going through this right now, this private, intense, really horrible and awful experience, and someone asks them about it, and talks to them about it, and gives them thoughts about it, and helps them come up with ideas for what to do about it? That might feel pretty good. And so what we have here not only is really important information that sort of debunks a myth about suicide, it also gives us a really good lesson in why it's important to not rely entirely upon intuition and sort of what sounds philosophically appealing instead of looking at data. Because in this case, it makes sense to wonder whether asking about suicide is risky for people in general or for just high-risk individuals. But it also makes sense to think that talking about it with someone might make them feel a little bit better, a little bit more connected, a little more normalized. And so rather than just having to pick what sounds best to you, you can look at the evidence and see what happens. And again, this is not the only study that's shown this. There's a great study by David Rudd that showed that exposing people to risk factors, a list of risk factors for suicide, didn't cause any more distress than exposing people to a list of risk factors for heart attacks. Talking to people about suicide, when it's done correctly, when you're giving correct information, when you're assessing in a systematic, reasonable way, not only isn't harmful, it's helpful, particularly for people who are in need. So it's just a myth about suicide. I think I'm going to make a couple other videos on the same sort of general idea of misconceptions about this phenomenon. But this one's a really important one. If you want to learn more about it, go to the website, psychotherapybrownbag.com. I'll put the link in this video here. And also, if you are experiencing thoughts like this, or anyone you know is experiencing thoughts like this, I really, really encourage you to call 1-800-273-TALK. It's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. It's an excellent resource. It's free, it's anonymous, and it's available 24/7. I really couldn't encourage you more to call that number if you're in need or someone you know is. And again, I hope to see you guys sharing your comments on the website, and hope that you are encouraged to read more about this.